Hey guys, tonight we're stepping back into a world where logic took a long nap and superstition handled the night shift. The Middle Ages. If your cow stopped giving milk, the explanation wasn't "poor animal needs better feed." It was witchcraft. If you sneezed in church, you didn't reach for a handkerchief. People reached for holy water because they thought a demon was trying to dive bomb its way through your nostrils. And if your bread collapsed in the oven, forget bad yeast. Clearly, the devil had moved into your pantry. It sounds absurd now, but remember, medieval life was fragile. One bad harvest, one sickness, one accident could wreck a family. And when science wasn't there to blame, witches, demons, and even your neighbor's cow made perfect scapegoats. Before we dive in, do the modern version of warding off evil spirits. Hit that like button and subscribe. It won't protect you from demons, but it might save me from the YouTube algorithm. And if you're still awake, tell me in the comments where you're listening from. Don't worry, I promise not to accuse you of sorcery. Now, dim the lights, tuck yourself under a blanket that weighs less than a medieval cowhide, and let's wander into a world where bread loaves, sneezes, and cows were all evidence of the supernatural. You wake before dawn, startled by a rooster crowing far too early. Today you would groan, pull the blanket over your head, and blame the bird. In a medieval village, though, a mistimed crowing wasn't just annoying, it was an omen, a warning that something in the village was about to go wrong. Maybe a cow would stop giving milk, maybe bread would collapse in the oven, maybe someone's child would take ill. Ordinary frustrations were never ordinary, they were signs. Medieval people had a gift for turning every inconvenience into a supernatural conspiracy. A sneeze, for instance. In our time, it's hay fever or dust. Back then, it was a demon making a bid for your body through your nose. That's why people responded with "God bless you." It wasn't politeness, it was crisis management. Every sneeze was treated like a door left unlocked, and you never knew what might try to walk through. Imagine your friends chanting prayers around you every time you sneezed in the office. A little awkward, but in the Middle Ages, it was basic survival. Food misbehaved too. If your loaf of bread sank in the middle, that wasn't bad yeast. It was Satan meddling with your supper. Imagine believing the Prince of Darkness spent his time sabotaging loaves like some vengeful Great British Bake-Off contestant. But in a world without food science, something as simple as a collapsed loaf looked like evidence that the devil had taken up residence in your pantry. Animals played starring roles in these dramas. The family cow stopped producing milk? Witchcraft. Chickens laid fewer eggs? Demons. The goat gave you side-eye from the corner of the pen? Possessed. Medieval people didn't just rely on their animals, they suspected them. Every stall in the barn was a potential crime scene. The poor beasts carried not only the burden of labor, but the heavy weight of suspicion. Even dreams weren't safe. Wake up sweating from a nightmare, and you hadn't just had a restless night. You'd been visited by the night hag, a demoness who sat on your chest and filled your mind with terror. Today, we'd call it sleep paralysis. Try explaining that to a medieval villager, though. Easier to blame an invisible woman with terrible bedside manners. The church amplified these fears, embedding them into daily life. Bells didn't just call you to Mass. Their tolling was thought to drive away demons. Imagine a thunderous bell hammering over your house at dawn, not just as an alarm clock, but as spiritual pest control. Priests sprinkled holy water over beds, barns, churns, even livestock. If your butter refused to thicken, it wasn't your technique at fault. Someone had cursed your churn, and only a splash of holy water could coax it back. Today, you'd call a customer support line. In the Middle Ages, you called Father Peter. Suspicion spread fastest when misfortune struck. If a neighbor's child grew sick or a cow wasted away, the first explanation wasn't germs or parasites. It was witchcraft. All eyes turned toward the odd widow at the edge of the village, or the stooped man with the twitching eye. Difference was dangerous. If your bread always rose nicely while others failed, clearly you had made a deal with dark forces. Congratulations, you'd just been nominated as the next village witch. Charms cluttered homes like medieval antivirus software. A horseshoe nailed above the door. Garlic hung from rafters. Salt tossed into corners. Boots nailed upside down to confuse spirits. The result was a home that smelled like stew and looked like a scrapyard. But it gave comfort. People believed these small rituals were shields against chaos. And when life is fragile, even nonsense feels like armor. The body itself became a battlefield. Toothaches weren't cavities. They were demons gnawing at your skull. Stomach cramps weren't bad porridge. They were curses sent by jealous neighbors. People wore amulets against headaches, rubbed herbs on rashes, and prayed over indigestion. Every belch or cramp could be traced back to some unseen enemy. If your body betrayed you, it wasn't biology. It was sorcery. Even the air seemed dangerous. A strange fog drifting through fields might be the devil passing by. A sudden gust of wind at the door meant spirits were lurking. When everything in life is unpredictable, from crops to childbirth to sickness, it makes sense that people looked for meaning in the weather, the noises, even their own sneezes. Anything was easier than admitting the truth. Life was random and cruel. Yet superstition, for all its fear, offered comfort. If demons caused sickness, then holy water might cure it. If witches soured your milk, a charm could protect it. The world may have been terrifying, but it had rules. They were bad rules, inconsistent rules, but at least they gave shape to a universe that otherwise seemed indifferent. So you rise from your straw bed, muttering prayers as you pass the hearth. You sprinkle salt by the door. You glance nervously at the cow in the barn. Deep down, you know she's just a cow, but certainty is a luxury you don't have. And uncertainty? That was the demon everyone truly feared. You step outside into the crisp morning air. The first thing you see is the family cow, chewing lazily, as if she has all the time in the world. To you, she is just an animal, but in a medieval village, that cow is the center of the household economy, and, unfortunately, the #1 suspect whenever something goes wrong. Milk wasn't just milk, it was life. It filled children's bellies, churned into butter, aged into cheese. Without it, hunger loomed. And so, when the cow stopped producing, people didn't shrug and assume it was poor feed or a passing illness. They turned immediately to the supernatural. Witches had cursed her. Demons had perched on her back in the night. Someone had stolen the milk with magic. In short, the cow wasn't just a cow anymore. She was evidence in an ongoing trial between heaven and hell. Manuals circulated describing signs of bewitchment in livestock. If the milk curdled too quickly, if butter refused to churn, if a cow looked thin despite eating, it was never biology. It was sorcery. Imagine calling your vet and instead of a diagnosis, he tells you your neighbor's grandmother hexed your barn. That was everyday logic in the Middle Ages. Butter in particular caused panic. Churning was a miserable, time-consuming job. If the cream didn't turn, suspicion bubbled up. The solution? Whisper prayers into the churn, sprinkle holy water, or, in desperate moments, plunge a hot horseshoe into the cream to scare away spirits. The result was butter that tasted faintly of iron, but at least it was demon-free. One tale even claimed witches could steal milk by milking inanimate objects. They'd squeeze ropes, stools, or even knives, and somehow the magic would drain milk from your cow into their bucket miles away. Picture a woman earnestly squeezing a kitchen stool while your cow across the field starts looking suspiciously deflated. It's absurd, but people swore it happened, and courts heard testimony about it. Goats often found themselves in the same mess. Their shifty eyes, curling horns, and stubborn tempers made them natural scapegoats. They already looked like little devils, so villagers assumed they were on first-name terms with Satan. Chickens, too, weren't safe. Misshapen eggs, reduced laying, or simply wandering off could all be blamed on sorcery. But cows carried the heaviest weight. They were wealth on 4 legs. To lose one could mean ruin, so panic spread fast when anything went wrong. Neighbors eyed each other with suspicion. Was it the widow who always muttered under her breath? The traveling peddler who passed through last week? Or maybe the woman with a slightly smug smile when her butter churned faster than anyone else's? Envy and fear fed accusations, and soon someone would be branded a witch. The church leaned into this paranoia. Priests blessed cattle as readily as they blessed people. They sprinkled holy water in barns, held ceremonies to protect herds, and encouraged prayers over stubborn animals. Faith wasn't just for the soul, it was for the udder too. Imagine kneeling in church beside your cow, both of you hoping for divine intervention. Superstition turned barns into battlefields. Cows wore charms tied around their necks. Farmers whispered blessings before milking. Families crossed themselves when butter refused to form. Even the smell of sour milk became ominous. It wasn't just food gone bad. It was a message from dark forces. The irony is that cows, like people, just get sick. They eat poor feed, they pick up parasites, they age. But in a medieval village, biology was rarely the first thought. A sick cow wasn't a veterinary problem. It was a spiritual one. And a spiritual problem meant a human culprit. The witch next door, the jealous neighbor, the unlucky outsider. So you pour a small cup of milk in the morning, watching it curdle a little too quickly. Panic prickles at the back of your mind. Was it the weather? Or did someone lay a curse on your household? Your family drinks it cautiously, half expecting horns to sprout from their heads. The cow flicks her tail indifferently, oblivious to the cosmic drama swirling around her. Cows bore more than milk in the Middle Ages. They carried centuries of fear, suspicion, and blame. They were beasts of burden in more ways than one, not just pulling plows, but hauling the paranoia of an entire community. And, in the end, they remained what they always were: cows, unimpressed, indifferent, and chewing, while humans spun tales of witches and demons to explain what they didn't understand. The hut is quiet now, but the silence isn't reassuring. In the Middle Ages, silence was crowded. Shadows weren't just shadows. They leaned toward you, full of menace. Every creak in the rafters, every gust of wind through the door carried possibility. People lived in a constant state of listening, waiting, scanning. To defend themselves against this invisible army of fears, they didn't turn to reason. They turned to charms. A rusty horseshoe nailed above the door, garlic tied in strings from the rafters, salt tossed into corners, boots nailed upside down to confuse wandering spirits. Every home became a jumble of objects meant to guard against misfortune. Imagine walking into your neighbor's house and seeing garlic, iron, and random footwear nailed to the walls. You wouldn't call it interior design. You'd call it desperation. Garlic was popular not just because it grew easily, but because its pungent smell supposedly repelled demons. Carry cloves in your pocket, and you smelled like a soup pot, but at least the devil stayed away. Iron was sacred too. Nails, knives, or horseshoes were thought to be unbearable for spirits. Evil might be powerful, but apparently it drew the line at rusty nails. Amulets proliferated. A carved cross, a scrap of parchment with a verse, the bone of a small animal tucked into a pouch. Every peasant became a curator of odd talismans. It didn't matter if they worked. What mattered was the feeling of protection. In a world where illness struck suddenly and storms flattened crops overnight, protection was worth believing in. Curses were feared just as much as charms were trusted. A glare from the wrong person, a muttered phrase in the market, even envy itself could be considered a curse. If your child tripped on a rock, if your cow kicked over a bucket, if you developed a toothache, suspicion turned immediately to your neighbor. Someone must have wished you harm. Someone must have hexed your luck. The body was fertile ground for this paranoia. Headaches weren't dehydration. They were curses. Stomach cramps weren't spoiled food. They were ill will made manifest. Even hiccups could be blamed on sorcery. Imagine living in a world where your hiccup is your neighbor's fault. Medieval paranoia made every burp, every cough, every ache into evidence of a supernatural attack. Holy water became the duct tape of medieval life. Sprinkle it on your bed to ward off nightmares. Sprinkle it on your cow to restore her milk. Drip it into your churn when butter refused to form. It was medicine, shield, and repair kit all in one. When in doubt, add holy water. Today, we reset the Wi-Fi router. Back then, they sprinkled blessings. And it wasn't just the villagers. The church itself leaned on ritual. Relics, bones of saints, splinters of the true cross, teeth of holy men, were prized as spiritual defenses. Pilgrims traveled miles to touch or even glimpse them, convinced they offered divine protection. Whether it was placebo or faith didn't matter. What mattered was hope. Fear created its own economy. People paid for blessings, bought charms, traded in relics. Fear made the world turn as surely as the seasons. And those who could manipulate that fear, priests, healers, cunning folk, held power. Imagine lying in bed with a fever. Your family huddles around, whispering prayers, hanging charms above you, sprinkling holy water across your blanket. In truth, you might just have a cold, but to them, it is a battle for your soul. Your suffering becomes evidence of curses, and your recovery, if it comes, proof that the charms worked. Superstition shaped the calendar too. Certain days were unlucky. Certain phases of the moon dictated when to plant, when to marry, when to cut your hair. Life became a constant dance of avoidance, tiptoeing around invisible traps. If you had a bad day, you didn't chalk it up to chance. You had chosen the wrong day to act. The irony is that all this fear created a sense of control. If curses were real, then counter-curses worked. If demons stalked the night, then charms could hold them at bay. Even terror had rules, and rules meant survival, or at least the illusion of it. So you lie down again, muttering a charm under your breath, clutching a small amulet, hoping that the shadow in the corner is only the cat. You breathe in the smoky air, the garlic and sweat, the faint tang of iron nails hammered into the beams above. You're not certain you're safe, but certainty is rare. What matters is that you've done everything possible to guard yourself. The rest is in the hands of God, fate, or maybe just the neighbor you secretly suspect. And with that uneasy thought, you drift into a restless sleep, trusting garlic, nails, and holy water to hold the demons back until morning. And so, you've made it through another medieval night, or at least survived the attempt. You've sidestepped curses, muttered charms, blessed the butter churn, and suspiciously eyed the cow. Not exactly restful, but then sleep in the Middle Ages was never restful. It's easy for us to laugh. Garlic nailed above the door, holy water poured into cream, priests blessing livestock as if God's to-do list included barn duty. But beneath the absurdity was a kind of fragile logic. If you could name the enemy, you could fight it. If demons caused sickness, then prayers might cure it. If witches soured your bread, then charms might protect it. Life was terrifying, yes, but superstition at least gave it rules. Bad rules, inconsistent rules, but rules nonetheless. Fear of witches, demons, and even cows wasn't just paranoia. It was survival wrapped in ritual. The world was unpredictable, and people needed something to cling to. Even if it was nonsense, it was comforting nonsense. So next time your Wi-Fi drops or your bread machine fails, be glad you don't live in a world where your neighbors would accuse you of consorting with Satan. Blame the router, not the devil. Blame the yeast, not the witch. Thank you for wandering through this strange corner of medieval life with me tonight. If you're still awake, you're tougher than most villagers who by now would have already blamed you for their misfortunes. If you enjoyed this journey, do the modern charm against obscurity. Like the video, subscribe for more, and tell me in the comments, if your cow suddenly stopped giving milk, who would you blame first? The witch, the demon, or the cow herself? Now dim the lights a little more, settle under the blanket, and let the charms and garlic rest. No demons will trouble you here. Only sleep, the safest superstition of them all. You try to imagine a peaceful night's sleep. A bed, a blanket, a pillow that isn't alive. Then you open your eyes and reality smacks you in the face with smoke, stink, and snoring. Welcome to the Viking Longhouse, the place where personal space goes to die. The Longhouse is supposed to be the heart of the Norse household, a warm refuge against the cold Scandinavian night. In practice, it's a wooden shoebox packed with bodies, animals, smoke, and fleas. You shuffle across the uneven dirt floor to your allotted patch of straw, which crunches suspiciously under your weight. Half of it is old bedding, half of it is something the goat left behind. You sigh and lower yourself down, adjusting your cloak, telling yourself you'll get used to it. Spoiler, you won't. The fire in the middle of the Longhouse burns low, glowing embers barely keeping the chill away. It should be comforting, but instead, the smoke drifts lazily into the rafters and lingers like a stubborn ghost. You cough. Someone across the hall coughs back. This becomes a duet, then a trio. By the end of the night, you could form a full Viking chorus of respiratory distress. Around you, the family settles in. That means 10, maybe 20 people, all stretched out shoulder to shoulder. Vikings didn't believe in bedrooms. They believed in communal everything. Privacy was an abstract concept, like central heating or personal hygiene. If you wanted to be alone, your best bet was death. The animals join the party. Chickens roost in the rafters, their droppings occasionally reminding you that gravity still works. Goats bleat, cows shuffle, and the family pig snores louder than your uncle. These creatures aren't guests, they're residents. The Longhouse wasn't just for people. It was a barn with a hearth. Animals provided warmth, and warmth meant survival. But it also meant your pillow oinks at you in the night. The smell is indescribable. Imagine wool damp from snow, mixed with fish drying overhead, animal dung underfoot, and bodies that haven't seen a bath since Odin was a teenager. The Longhouse doesn't just smell, it assaults. You breathe in, and your lungs stage a protest. It's less home sweet home and more smoked human experiment. Then come the fleas. They thrive in the straw bedding, in the furs, in the seams of your cloak. You scratch constantly, knowing the battle is hopeless. A good night is measured not by sleep, but by how many pints of blood you manage to keep for yourself. Fleas don't discriminate. They bite men, women, children, animals. The fleas were the true lords of the Longhouse. Noise is the final insult. People snore, cough, mutter in their sleep. Babies wail, dogs bark, cows low, and occasionally a chicken decides midnight is the perfect time to announce the dawn. Every sound bounces off the wooden walls, turning the Longhouse into an echo chamber of misery. You pull your cloak over your head, praying for silence. But the only result is breathing in your own recycled air mixed with smoke. Congratulations, you've invented self-asphyxiation. There are moments, brief ones, when the chaos lulls. The fire dims to a faint glow, and the snores synchronize into something almost rhythmic. You close your eyes and imagine you've drifted into a hall of warriors, awaiting glory in Valhalla. Then the pig lets out a snort so violent it rattles the floor, and you're back to reality. Sleep in a Viking longhouse isn't rest. It's endurance. You measure the night not by hours of slumber, but by how many crises you survive. The coughs, the fleas, the smells, the rooster that doesn't understand time. By dawn, your eyes sting, your throat burns, your body itches, and you're grateful to step outside into the freezing cold, because at least the cold is honest. This is life inside the longhouse. Crowded, smoky, noisy, and unforgettable, though not in a good way. You might live another day, but you'll do it bleary-eyed and scratching. The fire should help you sleep. That's what you tell yourself as you stare at its dull orange glow in the center of the longhouse. Flames lick at the logs, sending a wavering light across the timber walls. For a moment, it looks almost cozy. Then the smoke hits you. Thick, acrid, and stubborn, it curls upward, filling the hall like an invisible second roof. The longhouse has no chimney, just a hole in the ceiling that never seems big enough. So the smoke gathers, lingering at head level, searing your eyes and stinging your lungs. You cough, your neighbor coughs, and before long, the entire hall coughs in unison. It's less a family home and more a tuberculosis choir. The smell is worse. You'd think your nose would eventually surrender, stop noticing, give up, but no. Every inhale brings a new horror. Smoke mixes with the sour stench of damp wool, the tang of dried fish hanging overhead, the musk of animals crammed alongside you, and the unwashed sweat of your companions. The floor adds its own bouquet, packed earth soaked with years of spills, droppings, and whatever fluids life in a longhouse leaves behind. Step lightly, because your bare feet will find history's least appealing puddles. As the night stretches on, the chorus of smells grows. The cow shifts and releases a gift. Someone nearby snores so hard their breath seems to carry its own scent. And then there's the pig. The pig is the final insult. Pigs don't just smell, they perfume the entire room with an aroma that could wake the dead. You roll over, pressing your cloak against your face, wishing it smelled less like smoke and more like escape. The noises refuse to let you drift off. Snoring competes with coughing. Babies wail and are shushed. Dogs bark at shadows, convinced every flicker of firelight is a threat. The goats bleat for no reason, because goats never need a reason. Even the chickens get in on the act, scratching in the rafters above and occasionally dropping a little midnight surprise. The longhouse is a symphony of chaos, played on instruments no one asked to hear. Sleep, if it comes, is shallow and brief. You drift, half-conscious, until the pig grunts, or the cow shuffles, or your uncle releases a snore that could summon Thor himself. Each time you think you've finally drifted into something resembling rest, you're pulled back by another sound, another itch, another cough. You lie there, eyes open, wondering if death in battle really would be the easier option. At least in Valhalla, you're promised endless feasts and proper bedding, or so you hope. The smoke makes your eyes water constantly. You blink and rub, but it only makes things worse. You wonder if you'll wake up blind, not from disease, but from trying to nap inside a permanent bonfire. The air is so heavy, it feels like you're chewing it. The longer you breathe, the more you convince yourself you've become part of the smoke, destined to float into the rafters and haunt this place forever. Your fellow sleepers don't make things better. One man tosses and mutters, reliving his battles in dreams, shouting half-phrases that jolt you awake. A child whimpers beside his mother. A dog scratches at fleas so violently you think it might dig through the floor. And through it all, the fleas never stop. You scratch and scratch, knowing it's useless, knowing you'll wake up covered in new bites. They don't just bite, they feast, throwing banquets across your skin while you lie helpless in the smoke. In moments like these, you try to imagine peace. Maybe the Longhouse will quiet. Maybe you'll grow used to the smells. Maybe the smoke will thin. But the Longhouse never gives peace. It gives endurance. By the time dawn finally threatens the horizon, you don't feel rested. You feel smoked, salted, and preserved, like the fish dangling above your head. You survived another night, but survival is not sleep. The truth is, Viking nights weren't glorious. They weren't filled with songs and stories around a fire. They were filled with smoke, stench, and scratching. And yet, families endured, because the Longhouse meant shelter, and shelter meant life. Comfort was a luxury. Survival was enough. So you sit up in the pale dawn, eyes red, throat raw, hair full of ash and straw, and step outside. The cold air slaps you awake, but it feels like freedom. The smoke stays behind. The smell lingers, of course, it always lingers, but at least you can breathe. You survived another sleepless night in the Longhouse. Congratulations! You're ready to do it all again tonight. And so, you've made it through the Longhouse night, if made it through is the right phrase. Survived, perhaps. Endured. Certainly not rested. The truth is, Viking sleep wasn't about comfort. It was about simply making it to dawn without choking on smoke, scratching yourself raw, or being trampled by the cow that decided to roll over in its sleep. The Longhouse was never meant for peace. It was a tool, shelter against snow and storms, a place where animals and people huddled together, feeding off each other's warmth, misery shared equally. Comfort was irrelevant. Privacy didn't exist. What mattered was life, and if the price of survival was fleas and smoke and a smell strong enough to haunt Valhalla itself, then so be it. It's tempting to imagine the Vikings as towering warriors, sleeping soundly before battle, dreaming of glory. The reality is they were just as bleary-eyed as the rest of us, waking with sore backs, raw throats, and the vague hope that one day death might finally bring a decent mattress. You're invited to dinner in ancient Rome. Lucky you, right? You imagine reclining gracefully on a couch, sipping wine while servants bring platters of delicacies. It sounds elegant until the food arrives. Then you realize Roman fine dining was less a feast and more a series of edible dares. The Romans prided themselves on extravagance. A wealthy host wanted to impress, and the best way to impress was by serving food that looked impressive, no matter how it tasted. The stranger, the rarer, the better. Flavor was optional. Comfort was irrelevant. The goal was spectacle. First course, dormice. Yes, mice. Fat little rodents, plucked from their burrows, force-fed until they looked like tiny sausages, then roasted or stuffed with nuts and honey. They arrive glistening on a platter, tails curled like garnish. Everyone claps politely. You stare, wondering how you'll explain to your stomach that this is dinner and not a practical joke. Next comes a selection of seafood, but not the kind you'd expect. Romans adored sauces made from fermented fish guts known as garum. It was the ketchup of its day, poured over everything from meat to fruit. The smell hits you before the flavor does, sharp and sour, like someone tried to bottle low tide. You drizzle it onto your bread to avoid offending your host, then spend the rest of the meal regretting every life decision that led you here. If you think dessert will save you, think again. Romans occasionally served dishes dyed with bright pigments, not because they tasted better, but because they looked unusual. Bread might be green. Wine might be spiced into something more like perfume than drink. Sweetness wasn't the priority. The goal was novelty, and novelty, unfortunately, often tasted like disappointment. The rich hosted these feasts to flaunt wealth, to prove they could import delicacies from faraway lands. Ostrich eggs, flamingo tongues, peacock brains. Exotic? Yes. Edible? Barely. Imagine chewing on a tongue the size of a shoe, rubbery and bland, while your host beams proudly at their ability to afford such nonsense. You nod politely, praying you don't choke. Meanwhile, the poor dined on gruel and bread, and while it wasn't glamorous, it probably spared them the misery of choking down exotic bird organs. Hunger is miserable, yes, but so is being forced to eat peacock brains while pretending to enjoy yourself. The feasts were long, drawn-out affairs, lasting hours. Reclining on a couch sounded sophisticated, until you realized you were lying sideways trying not to spill garum on your toga. Servants hovered with more dishes, each stranger than the last. The more exotic the platter, the more you wished you'd stayed home with a loaf of plain bread. And then, when you thought you'd reached your limit, they offered wine, watered down. Romans looked down on anyone who drank wine neat. It was considered barbaric. So instead of numbing your senses with alcohol, you sipped lightly flavored water while preparing for the next course of regret. The real endurance test wasn't the food itself, but the expectation that you showed delight. Gagging was frowned upon. Vomiting, well, there's a reason rumors about vomitoriums exist. Though historians will tell you they weren't dining rooms for puking, the fact that the idea sticks says everything about how indulgent these feasts could feel. Too much food, too much strangeness, too much show. By the end of the night, you leave the table full, but not satisfied. Your stomach churns with dormice, garum, and goose liver. You smell faintly of fermented fish. You've survived, but barely. A Roman feast wasn't comfort, it was spectacle. Food became theater, and the diners were unwilling actors forced to chew their lines. And you thought airline food was bad. You sit down at a rough wooden table, a clay bowl in front of you. You're hungry, but hunger in the Middle Ages isn't so much a craving as it is a condition. Food is survival, not pleasure. And when food does arrive, it's rarely a delight. In fact, most meals hover somewhere between barely edible and culinary crime. The peasant diet was monotonous, centered around porridge, bread, and whatever could be scavenged. Oats boiled into mush, barley bread as hard as a shield, cabbages stewed until they surrendered. It filled the belly, but joy wasn't part of the recipe. Salt was precious, spices were exotic luxuries, and sugar was something you'd never even heard of. Your taste buds withered from neglect. Take pottage, for instance. It was the cornerstone of medieval dining, a kind of perpetual stew that never quite ended. Families added scraps each day. A carrot here, some barley there, maybe a bit of onion if fortune smiled. It simmered endlessly in the same pot, evolving into a sludge that looked more like medieval regret than food. The pot was never cleaned, just topped up. Generations of flavor, if you want to call it that, clung stubbornly to the iron walls. It was less a recipe and more an ecosystem. Then there was bread. But don't imagine golden loaves, soft and fluffy. Medieval bread was dense, coarse, and often adulterated with whatever filler could be found. Rye if you were lucky, peas or beans if you weren't. Some loaves even contained ground-up tree bark or straw. Eating it was like chewing on a lecture about poverty. And if you were really unlucky, the flour might be contaminated with ergot, a fungus that could cause hallucinations, convulsions, and death. Imagine biting into toast and seeing demons dance in the corner. Breakfast with a side of nightmare. The wealthy had more variety, but variety often meant excess. Nobles feasted on roasted swans, peacocks, and boars, all dressed up to look impressive. A swan might be cooked and then redressed in its own feathers for display, like taxidermy with gravy. The flavor? Tough, greasy, and stringy. But it looked spectacular, which was what mattered. Eating was a performance, and you were the audience and the victim at once. Spices were a status symbol, imported at great expense. Dishes might be drowned in cinnamon, cloves, or pepper, not because it tasted good, but because it screamed wealth. You'd gnaw on heavily spiced meat until your tongue went numb, nodding appreciatively while secretly wondering if plain porridge might have been better. And then there were the bizarre recipes. Jellied eels. Meat pies stuffed with birds that flew out when you cut them open. Custards dyed with saffron until they glowed unnaturally bright. Sometimes entire feasts were designed less for taste and more for shock value. Surprise! Your pie just flapped its wings. Bon appetit! For the average villager, though, the misery was quieter. Meals were thin soups, coarse bread, and weak ale. Ale was drunk constantly, not because everyone wanted to party, but because water was often unsafe. So you downed pint after pint of warm, flat beer, slowly realizing you were both malnourished and mildly drunk. Food poisoning was common. Preservation was poor, storage crude, and meat often suspect. You'd carve into a joint of pork and find it smelled less like dinner and more like regret. Did people stop eating? Of course not. Hunger was worse than flavor. You ate what you had, prayed over it, and hoped the holy blessing outweighed the mold. And yet, despite the misery, mealtime was central. Families gathered around the pottage, nobles boasted over grotesque feasts, and communities found comfort in the ritual of eating together. Even if the bread broke your teeth, it gave you belonging. So you dip your spoon into the bubbling pottage, chew bread as dense as masonry, and wash it down with ale that tastes faintly of smoke. Your stomach groans, but your heart accepts it. This is food in the Middle Ages. Survival disguised as supper, misery dressed as nourishment. It fills you, but it never delights you. And so, you've survived dinner with the ancients. You've chewed through Roman delicacies that tasted like dares, gnawed at bread dense enough to qualify as masonry, and sipped ale that was less refreshment and more resignation. You've politely clapped at feasts where peacocks were dressed in their own feathers, and nodded approvingly while secretly praying for plain porridge. The truth is, ancient food wasn't about pleasure. For the poor, it was survival. Gruel, pottage, hard bread, it kept you alive, but it didn't make you happy. For the wealthy, it was theater. Food was meant to shock, impress, and intimidate. If your guests left full but miserable, you'd done your job. It's easy to laugh at the absurdity of dormice, garum, or swan pie. But beneath the humor lies a reminder. In every era, food reflects fear and status. The poor feared hunger. The rich feared appearing ordinary. The result was the same: meals that rarely tasted as good as they looked. So next time you complain about cold takeout or airplane food, remember, at least your sandwich isn't stuffed with eels, your wine isn't watered down, and your bread isn't laced with fungus that makes you hallucinate demons. Compared to history, your leftovers are luxury. The sun beats down on the Nile, relentless, unblinking. In the heat of ancient Egypt, cleanliness wasn't just a matter of vanity, it was survival. You wake each day coated in a layer of dust and sweat, the desert clinging to your skin like an extra garment. To fight back, Egyptians turned hygiene into ritual, a blend of practicality, religion, and some practices that would make a modern spa customer flee. Bathing was central. Ordinary people didn't have marble tubs, but they made do with the Nile, or basins filled with water hauled by hand. A quick rinse wasn't optional, it was daily routine. Priests went further. They bathed multiple times a day, convinced that physical purity kept them spiritually strong. Imagine trying to pray while also smelling like a goat in midsummer. Not exactly divine. Soap, as we know it, didn't exist. Instead, Egyptians scrubbed with natron, a naturally occurring salt mixture dug from dry lake beds. It was brilliant at drying out sweat and killing bacteria, but it was also brilliant at drying out skin. Your body felt clean, yes, but also like it had been left in the desert sun too long. Smoothness was sacrificed for sanitation. Oils were the great solution. Egyptians lathered themselves in scented oils after washing, both to mask odors and to soften skin parched by natron. These oils weren't subtle. Perfumes of lotus, myrrh, and frankincense wafted through markets, temples, and bedrooms. Walk through a crowd and you smelled like an entire bouquet arranged by a perfumer with no off switch. For some, it was heavenly. For others, overwhelming. Either way, it beat smelling like damp linen and onions. Cosmetics played their part. Men and women alike painted their eyes with kohl, a mixture of soot and minerals, not just for beauty, but for supposed protection. It was believed to ward off eye infections and the glare of the desert sun. Did it work? Possibly. Did it also mean everyone's eyeliner smeared dramatically in the heat? Definitely. Walk into a temple and half the congregation looked like raccoons halfway through a rock concert. Shaving was another obsession. Body hair wasn't just unfashionable, it was unclean. Wealthy Egyptians shaved heads and wore wigs, partly to keep lice away, partly for status. Priests shaved every inch of their bodies to maintain ritual purity. Picture a bald, shiny man in 40-degree heat explaining that hairlessness brings him closer to the gods. Meanwhile, you're just trying not to burn your scalp. And wigs weren't subtle affairs. They were elaborate, perfumed, and often slathered in animal fat to keep them glossy. Yes, fat. The idea was that the sun would melt the fat, releasing perfume through the day. To modern ears, that sounds like wearing a candle on your head and hoping for the best. By afternoon, you'd smell expensive, yes, but also faintly roasted. Teeth were another battlefield. Without toothbrushes, Egyptians turned to frayed twigs, chewing them into makeshift brushes. They rubbed with powders made from ash, pumice, or crushed eggshells. Effective at scraping off grime, but brutal on enamel. The result? By middle age, many Egyptians had teeth ground down to nubs. Imagine smiling confidently at a neighbor, only for them to wonder whether you'd been gnawing on rocks. Hygiene wasn't just personal. It was religious, social, and deeply symbolic. To be clean was to be civilized, close to the gods, protected from chaos. To be dirty was to court disaster. Yet for all the care, life in Egypt wasn't exactly fragrant bliss. The oils masked sweat, the natron stripped skin, the wigs melted, and the teeth ground away. Still, in a land where the desert pressed in from every side, the Egyptians clung to cleanliness with determination. Every bath, every oil, every dab of coal was an act of defiance against heat, dust, and decay. You scratch at the salt crust left on your arms, smear on another layer of oil, and tell yourself, you are clean. Sort of. You'd think that with all the bathing and perfumed oils, the Egyptians would have had hygiene perfected. But no. Beneath the polished veneer of cleanliness were practices that were, frankly, unpleasant, occasionally painful, and almost always smelly. Take dental care. Egyptians believed in keeping mouths clean, but their methods would horrify your dentist. Tooth powder often contained ground pumice, ash, or even pulverized ox hooves. Scrubbing your teeth with this mixture left them gleaming, yes, but also worn down like ancient sandstone. By middle age, many Egyptians had teeth so eroded they barely functioned. Imagine flashing a smile while simultaneously explaining you can no longer chew bread. Then there were perfumes. To cover the less glamorous odors of daily life, Egyptians doused themselves in strong scents. Perfumed cones of wax infused with oils were perched on top of wigs or shaved heads. As the day wore on, the cone melted, dripping fragrant grease down your hair and shoulders. From afar, you smelled divine. Up close, you looked like someone had dropped a candle on your head. Body hair removal was another ordeal. Lacking razors as we know them, Egyptians relied on sharpened bronze blades or concoctions of honey and resin smeared onto the skin and then yanked off. Ancient waxing, as painful then as it is now, but without the comfort of aloe vera afterward. For priests who shaved their entire bodies, it was a constant, grueling process. Imagine doing full-body waxing in 40-degree heat while also fasting. Spiritual purity came with physical agony. Even ears and noses weren't spared. Some hygiene manuals recommended cleaning nostrils and ear canals with thin reeds or feathers. Effective, perhaps. Comfortable? Not at all. You sneeze, you cough, and suddenly your cleansing ritual feels like medieval acupuncture invented early. And while oils and perfumes masked much, they also fermented in the heat. Wigs saturated with animal fat and perfume cones dripping onto skin created an aroma that was complex. Sweet, yes, but also sour, smoky, and vaguely rancid by evening. You might start the day as a flower and end it as a compost heap. The obsession with cleanliness was tied to religion. To approach the gods, one had to be pure. Priests shaved, bathed, oiled, and perfumed constantly. Temples had entire systems for washing, purifying, and anointing. The result was a society where being clean wasn't just fashionable, it was divine duty. Yet in practice, it meant living in a cycle of scrubbing, scraping, waxing, and slathering, all while smelling like a perfume factory in the desert sun. And still, the Nile wasn't free of disease. Parasites, bacteria, and sand carried into homes meant that no matter how much natron you scrubbed or how many cones you melted, true hygiene was elusive. Egyptians were among the cleanest of the ancient world and still suffered the same ailments as everyone else. You could smear yourself in frankincense daily, but your stomach might still betray you after drinking Nile water. So you sit at the end of a long day, skin raw from natron, scalp bald from shaving, body dripping with perfumed wax, and teeth ground down by pumice. Do you feel clean? Sort of. Do you smell good? From a distance, maybe. Up close, probably not. But in the grand theater of Egyptian life, you look purified, and that was what mattered. And so, you've made it through a day in ancient Egypt. Washed, shaved, oiled, and perfumed. On the surface, it sounds luxurious. Daily baths in the Nile, fragrant oils, elegant wigs. But peel back the glamour, and it was more ordeal than indulgence. Natron left skin cracked, pumice ground teeth into dust, and wax cones dripped steadily like perfumed candles melting down your scalp. Hygiene here wasn't just about comfort. It was about religion, order, and survival in a world where dust, heat, and disease pressed in from every direction. Priests shaved every inch of themselves, not to look fashionable, but to remain pure before the gods. Families scrubbed themselves raw with salts and smeared on oils, not just to smell pleasant, but to convince themselves they had mastered the desert that refused to be tamed. It's easy to laugh at wigs full of fat or noses probed with reeds, but for the Egyptians, these habits weren't oddities. They were shields. Shields against chaos, shields against dirt, shields against the fear that the desert and death were always just a little too close. Now, close your eyes. Take a deep breath of clean, modern air. Appreciate your toothpaste, your shampoo, and your soap that doesn't double as sandpaper. Tonight, you are cleaner and luckier than any pharaoh. Sleep well.